What if one of the most troubling questions in the Bible was never really about the question we think it is? For centuries, readers have returned to the same story with a sense of confusion, curiosity, and even discomfort. It is a story that begins with a command so unexpected that it has sparked debate across generations. Why would God ask Abraham to do something that seemed to contradict everything he had promised? Why would the man known as the father of faith face a test that appears almost impossible to understand? Even today, millions of people continue to wrestle with these questions. Some see the story as a test of obedience. Others see it as a lesson about trust. Still others believe it points to something much larger, something that stretches far beyond Abraham himself. But before we can understand the meaning of this event, we have to step back and see the bigger picture. Because this story did not begin on a mountain. It began decades earlier. Abraham was not just another traveler wandering through the ancient world. He was a man who had left behind everything familiar after hearing a call from God. He left his homeland. He left his extended family. He stepped into a future he could not see. And along the way, God made a promise that seemed almost impossible. Abraham would become the father of a great nation. His descendants would be countless. Through him, blessings would reach the world. The promise sounded extraordinary. There was only one problem. Abraham and his wife Sarah were growing old, and year after year, the promised child did not come. Time passed. Seasons changed. Hopes rose and fell. Yet Abraham continued forward, holding on to a promise that appeared increasingly unlikely. Then, when all human expectations had nearly disappeared, the impossible happened. Isaac was born. His name became a reminder of joy and amazement. More than a son, Isaac represented the future. He represented the fulfillment of everything God had promised. Every hope Abraham carried seemed connected to this one child. Every vision of tomorrow seemed to pass through Isaac. That is what makes the story so difficult to understand. Because when we arrive at the opening of Genesis chapter 22, everything appears secure. The promise has been fulfilled. The long wait is over. The future looks clear. And then To understand what happened next, we have to leave the familiar world of modern assumptions and step into the ancient world Abraham knew. It was a world very different from our own. There were no nations as we know them today, no modern cities stretching across miles of highways, and no written libraries filled with generations of recorded history. Life revolved around families, tribes, livestock, seasonal migrations, and survival. A person's future was tied directly to the next generation. Sons carried family names forward. Sons inherited property. Sons protected aging parents. Sons represented continuity, stability, and hope. In that world, the birth of Isaac was not simply a personal blessing. It was the foundation of Abraham's entire future. Yet there is another detail many modern readers overlook. Throughout the ancient Near East, people worshipped many different gods. Every region had its own religious traditions. Every city had its own temples and sacred customs. Some cultures believed the gods demanded extreme demonstrations of loyalty and devotion. Religious practices varied widely, and fear often played a major role in how people approached their deities. This historical context matters because Abraham's story was unfolding in a world filled with competing beliefs about who God was and what he desired from humanity. From the beginning, Abraham's journey had been different. The God who called him was not like the gods worshipped by surrounding nations. Again and again, Abraham experienced a relationship built on promises rather than fear. God guided him, protected him, provided for him. Even when Abraham made mistakes, the covenant remained intact. Yet faith is often easiest when looking backward. Looking forward is another matter entirely. By the time Isaac was growing into a young man, Abraham had accumulated decades of experience with God. He had witnessed extraordinary events. He had seen promises fulfilled that once seemed impossible. But faith is not measured only by past victories. Sometimes it is tested when the future becomes unclear. This is where the story becomes deeply personal. Imagine waiting decades for a promise. Imagine enduring disappointment, uncertainty, and years of unanswered questions. Then imagine finally receiving exactly what you had hoped for. Most people would assume the struggle was over. Most people would believe the difficult chapter had ended. Abraham could have thought the same. Yet the Bible often reveals a surprising pattern. The greatest moments of spiritual growth frequently arrive after success, not before it. The challenge comes not when nothing has been received, but when something precious is finally placed into a person's hands. That raises an uncomfortable question. What happens when a blessing becomes so important that it begins to overshadow the one who gave it? This question reaches beyond Abraham's world. It reaches into every generation. Human beings naturally cling to what they value most. Careers, families, dreams, achievements, security, and plans for the future can gradually become the center of life. Without realizing it, people can begin trusting the gift more than the giver. Was that what this story was about? Was Abraham being asked to prove where his ultimate trust rested? At this point in the narrative, the answer is still hidden. The Bible has not yet revealed the full purpose behind the events that are about to unfold. What we do know is that Abraham stood at a unique moment in history. The promise was real. The covenant was advancing. The future seemed secure. And then came a command that would force him to confront a question far deeper than obedience alone. A question that would follow him during every step of a journey that was about to begin. The command had been given, and now the journey began. The Bible describes what happened next with remarkable restraint. There is no lengthy explanation, no recorded debate, and no detailed account of Abraham's emotions. Instead, the narrative moves forward with quiet determination. Early the next morning, Abraham prepared for travel. Accompanied by Isaac and servants from his household, he set out toward the place God had indicated. According to the biblical account, the journey would take 3 days. 3 days. In modern life, that may sound like a simple detail. Yet those 3 days may be among the most significant in the entire story. Every mile traveled carried Abraham farther from certainty, and deeper into a test he could not fully understand. The landscape around him likely changed as the group moved through hills, valleys, and open terrain. The rhythm of travel would have been familiar. Footsteps across dusty paths. Camps established as daylight faded. Quiet mornings before setting out again. To an outside observer, it may have looked like an ordinary journey. But beneath the surface, nothing about it was ordinary. One of the most fascinating details in the narrative is what the Bible does not tell us. It does not reveal the conversations Abraham had with himself during those 3 days. It does not tell us what questions filled his mind. It does not record sleepless nights or moments of doubt. The silence forces readers to imagine the weight of those hours. Abraham had spent years learning to trust God. Yet trust does not eliminate questions. Faith does not always remove uncertainty. Sometimes faith means continuing forward even when the next step is difficult to understand. This is where many people misunderstand biblical faith. Faith is often portrayed as complete confidence with no struggle involved. The stories of Scripture present something more realistic. Again and again, faith appears in the middle of uncertainty. People move forward not because they have every answer, but because they trust the character of the one leading them. Abraham knew God's promises. He knew God's faithfulness. He knew the history they shared. But he did not yet know how this story would end. Neither did Isaac. As the journey continued, the young man traveled beside his father, likely unaware of the deeper significance of what lay ahead. Isaac was not merely a participant in the story. He was the living symbol of everything God had promised. The future seemed connected to him in ways neither he nor anyone else could fully comprehend. Then, after 3 days, Abraham saw the destination in the distance. The moment must have felt different from all the days before it. What had once been a future event was now directly ahead. The place of decision was no longer theoretical. It was real. Close enough to see. Close enough to reach. At that point, the journey itself had already revealed something important. Abraham had been given multiple opportunities to turn back, multiple opportunities to abandon the path. Yet he continued forward. Why? The answer remains one of the great mysteries of the account. But as the mountain came into view, another question began to emerge. If Abraham trusted that God's promises were still true, what did he believe would happen next? As the destination drew near, the narrative entered its most challenging phase. The journey was no longer about distance. It was about confrontation. Abraham had spent 3 days moving toward a moment he could not fully explain, and now the place God had designated stood before him. According to the account, he instructed the servants to remain behind while he and Isaac continued alone. That detail may seem small at first, but it carries tremendous significance. The final part of the journey was intensely personal. No crowd witnessed it. No community gathered around it. No outside voices offered advice or interpretation. What happened next unfolded between a father, a son, and the God who had guided their lives for decades. As they began ascending the mountain, Isaac noticed something unusual. The necessary items for worship had been prepared, yet one important question remained. The Bible records Isaac asking his father where the offering would come from. It is one of the most memorable questions in the entire narrative because it reveals how little Isaac understood about the deeper tensions surrounding the moment. Abraham's response was brief but profound. He declared that God himself would provide. For generations, readers have paused at those words. Were they spoken with certainty? Hope? Trust? Did Abraham fully understand what he was saying? The text does not answer those questions directly. Instead, it allows the statement to linger in the minds of readers. God will provide. Those 3 words would eventually become one of the defining themes of the entire story. Yet at that moment, the future remained hidden. Abraham still did not know how events would unfold. He simply continued forward. This is where the account becomes especially powerful. Modern readers often want immediate explanations. We prefer clear answers before taking difficult steps. We want certainty before commitment. Abraham received neither. He was not shown the final chapter before beginning the journey. He was not given a detailed roadmap explaining every outcome. Instead, he moved forward one step at a time, trusting what he knew about God's character even when he did not understand God's plan. That distinction is important. Trusting a plan is easy when every detail is visible. Trusting a person requires something deeper. Throughout his life, Abraham had learned that God's promises could be trusted even when circumstances appeared impossible. He had seen unexpected provision before. He had watched obstacles give way to outcomes he never could have predicted. Perhaps those memories sustained him as he climbed higher. Perhaps they reminded him that the God who had given Isaac could not be separated from the promises connected to Isaac. Yet the tension continued to grow. Every step raised the stakes. Every moment increased the mystery. Readers know they are approaching a turning point, but the narrative refuses to reveal its answer too soon. Instead, it forces us to experience a portion of Abraham's uncertainty. We know the question. We know the promise. We know the apparent conflict between the two. What we do not know is how they can possibly fit together. And that unanswered question becomes the driving force behind everything that follows as father and son approach the place where one of the most important revelations in Scripture is about to unfold. At this point, the story reaches a level of tension that few passages in Scripture can match. Yet what makes the moment so remarkable is not what happens on the surface. It is what may have been happening inside Abraham's mind. The Bible gives only a few details, but those details invite us to look deeper. By now, Abraham had lived through experiences that would have seemed impossible when he first left his homeland. He had watched God keep promises through years of uncertainty. He had seen situations change in ways no human plan could have achieved. Every major chapter of his journey had taught the same lesson: God's perspective was larger than his own. That history mattered now more than ever. Many readers focus on the difficulty of the command, but another question deserves attention. What allowed Abraham to keep moving forward when the outcome remained hidden? The answer may be found in the promises God had already given him. Isaac was not simply a beloved son. Isaac was connected to a covenant that God himself had established. Abraham knew that the future of an entire nation was tied to that promise. Generations yet unborn were tied to that promise. Everything God had declared about the future seemed to pass through Isaac. This creates an apparent contradiction. How could the promise remain secure if the path forward appeared uncertain? The Bible later offers an intriguing insight. The writer of Hebrews suggests that Abraham believed God was fully capable of preserving his promises regardless of circumstances. In other words, Abraham's confidence was not based on understanding every detail. It was based on trust in God's ability to accomplish what he had promised. That perspective changes how we view the entire narrative. Abraham was not moving forward because he understood the plan. He was moving forward because he trusted the one who held the plan. There is a significant difference. Most people prefer explanations before obedience. Abraham demonstrated a willingness to trust before receiving explanations. This does not mean the journey was emotionally easy. It means his confidence rested somewhere deeper than immediate understanding. In many ways, this is where the story becomes surprisingly relevant to modern life. Every generation encounters moments when circumstances seem to conflict with expectations. People pray for direction and encounter delays. They pursue goals and face setbacks. They receive promises and then experience seasons that make those promises difficult to see. The temptation is always the same: to judge the future based solely on present circumstances. Abraham's example points in another direction. He chose to interpret present uncertainty through the lens of past faithfulness. As he stood on that mountain, he could not see the ending. He could not predict the resolution. But he could remember every step that had brought him there. Every promise fulfilled. Every obstacle overcome. Every moment of unexpected provision. Those memories formed the foundation of his trust. Yet the greatest test was still ahead. The question that had followed him throughout the journey remained unanswered. God had provided guidance. God had provided promises. But would God provide a solution that preserved everything he had declared from the beginning? The answer was closer than Abraham realized, and the next moments would reveal something about God's character that generations of readers would never forget. The mountain had brought Abraham and Isaac to the edge of a mystery that neither of them could fully see. Everything in the story had been building toward this moment. The long years of waiting. The promise. The journey. The questions. Now all of it seemed to converge in a single place and time. The Bible's description remains remarkably simple, yet the emotional weight is impossible to miss. Abraham continued to follow the path that had been set before him. Isaac remained beside him. The silence that had accompanied much of the journey now became even more significant. There were no crowds. No witnesses. No explanations from heaven that revealed how the story would end. There was only trust, uncertainty, and a future hidden from human sight. For modern readers, this can feel uncomfortable. We naturally want resolution before tension reaches its peak. We want reassurance before the decisive moment arrives. Yet the narrative deliberately withholds that reassurance. It invites readers to stand in the same place Abraham stood, looking ahead without complete understanding. This is one reason the account has remained so powerful for thousands of years. It forces every generation to confront the same question. What does genuine trust look like when answers are absent? As events unfolded, Abraham demonstrated something extraordinary. His actions revealed that his confidence was anchored in God's faithfulness rather than in visible circumstances. He had reached the point where the promise and the problem seemed impossible to reconcile. Yet he continued forward. Not because he had solved the mystery, but because he believed God already had. That distinction changes everything. Faith, in the biblical sense, is not pretending difficulties do not exist. Faith is acknowledging the difficulty while refusing to believe it has the final word. Abraham had no visible evidence that a solution was coming. Yet he acted as though God's promises remained secure. This may explain why the tension of the story continues to rise even as Abraham remains remarkably steady. The reader feels the uncertainty. Abraham displays trust. The contrast is striking. Then, at the very moment when the narrative appears to have reached its highest level of suspense, everything changes. Without warning, the silence is broken. A message from heaven interrupts the sequence of events. Suddenly, the story takes a direction no reader could have predicted from the beginning. The interruption is immediate and decisive. Abraham is called by name. Not once but twice. The repetition carries urgency and purpose. It signals that something significant is happening. In an instant, the uncertainty that had dominated the journey begins to give way to clarity. The test had reached its conclusion. The question that had followed Abraham from the beginning was finally about to receive an answer. Yet the answer would reveal something far greater than a solution to a difficult situation. It would reveal the heart of the God who had been guiding the story all along. And what happened next would transform this event from a difficult biblical account into one of the most profound lessons about faith, provision, and divine purpose found anywhere in Scripture. The interruption changed everything. For 3 days, the narrative had been moving toward a question that seemed impossible to answer. Now, in a single moment, the direction of the story shifted. The voice that called to Abraham did more than stop the test. It revealed its purpose. The journey had never been about the loss of a promise. It had been about the depth of Abraham's trust in the one who made the promise. Then another detail appears in the account, a detail so important that it has echoed through centuries of biblical interpretation. Abraham looked up and saw unexpected provision waiting nearby. What he could not see during the journey was now directly in front of him. The solution had been there at exactly the right moment. Not 3 days earlier. Not after the story ended. At the precise point when it was needed. Suddenly, Abraham's earlier words to Isaac took on a deeper meaning. God will provide. What may have sounded like a statement of faith during the climb now became a visible reality. The provision did not come from Abraham's planning. It did not come from human ingenuity. It came from God Himself. This is why the location received a memorable name. Abraham called the place by a title that pointed future generations toward a profound truth. God sees the need and provides what is necessary at the right time. For many readers, this becomes the emotional turning point of the entire account. The story that began with confusion now begins to reveal clarity. The God who seemed distant suddenly appears deeply involved. The God who seemed silent reveals that He had been guiding events all along. Yet the significance of this moment extends beyond Abraham's personal experience. It challenges a common assumption about faith. Many people believe faith guarantees immediate explanations. The story suggests something different. Abraham did not receive understanding before the journey. He received understanding after demonstrating trust. The provision was real, but it was not visible from the starting point. It became visible only when the journey reached its appointed destination. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout Scripture. Again and again, people discover that God's provision often arrives in ways they could never have predicted. The solution rarely looks exactly as expected. The timing often feels later than desired. Yet when the story is viewed as a whole, a consistent theme emerges. God is not absent during uncertainty. He is often working in ways that cannot yet be seen. That realization transforms the meaning of everything that happened on the mountain. The test was never designed to destroy the promise. It was designed to reveal something about the promise giver. Abraham arrived with unanswered questions. He left with a deeper understanding of God's faithfulness. The mystery that had dominated the journey was finally beginning to lift. But one crucial question still remained. Why has this story continued to capture the attention of readers for thousands of years? Why does this ancient event feel larger than a single family's experience? The answer lies in a connection that reaches far beyond the mountain itself. A connection that would eventually give this story an even greater significance than Abraham could have imagined. With the immediate crisis resolved, the story could have ended there. Abraham had demonstrated trust. God had provided exactly what was needed. The promise remained intact. Yet the reason this account has endured for thousands of years is that it points beyond itself. The deeper meaning begins to emerge when we look at the larger biblical narrative. Throughout Scripture, certain events serve as patterns that prepare readers for future revelations. They are not merely isolated moments in history. They become signposts directing attention towards something greater. This mountain is one of those signposts. Consider the details. A beloved son stands at the center of the story. A father faces a test involving trust, surrender, and faithfulness. A miraculous provision appears at the crucial moment. A promise connected to future generations remains secure. None of these details are accidental. Together they create a picture that resonates throughout the rest of the Bible. For ancient readers, the account revealed something revolutionary about God's character. In a world where many people viewed the gods as unpredictable and demanding, this story presented a radically different message. The God of Abraham was not interested in fear-driven devotion. He was revealing himself as a God who provides, a God who keeps promises, and a God who remains faithful even when circumstances appear confusing. That truth alone makes the account remarkable. But the story reaches even deeper. The mountain becomes a place where two realities meet. Human trust meets divine faithfulness. Human limitation meets divine provision. Human uncertainty meets divine purpose. Abraham could see only a small part of the picture. God could see the entire story. This theme appears repeatedly throughout biblical history. Again and again, people encounter situations that seem impossible from a human perspective. Yet those situations often become the very places where God's faithfulness is revealed most clearly. The lesson is not that every challenge disappears immediately. The lesson is that God's purposes are often larger than what can be seen in a single moment. Looking back, Abraham's journey was never simply about reaching a destination. It was about discovering something deeper about the one he followed. The mountain revealed that God's promises and God's commands were never truly in conflict, even when they appeared to be. The apparent contradiction existed only because Abraham could not yet see the full picture. Many readers recognize the same pattern in their own lives. There are seasons when circumstances seem confusing. Questions remain unanswered. Directions feel unclear. Yet this ancient account reminds us that limited perspective does not mean God lacks a plan. Abraham learned that trust sometimes involves walking forward before understanding arrives. More importantly, he learned that God's provision often becomes visible only when the journey reaches the place God intended from the beginning. That realization transforms the entire narrative. The story is no longer primarily about a difficult test. It becomes a testimony to faithfulness, provision, and trust. Yet there remains one final layer of meaning, a connection that extends beyond Abraham's lifetime and reaches into the very heart of the biblical message itself. As the story draws to a close, its deepest meaning finally comes into view. What began as a personal test in the life of Abraham became one of the most significant moments in the entire biblical narrative. The reason is simple. The account does not merely tell us something about Abraham. It tells us something about God. Throughout the journey, one truth emerged again and again. God remained faithful to his promises even when circumstances seemed impossible to understand. The future that appeared uncertain was never uncertain from God's perspective. The provision that seemed invisible was already known to him. The solution that Abraham could not imagine was already part of a larger plan. This is why the story continues to resonate across centuries. It speaks to one of the most universal human experiences, living with unanswered questions. Every generation faces moments when the path ahead appears unclear. People encounter challenges they did not expect, delays they do not understand, and circumstances that seem to conflict with their hopes. In those moments, it is easy to believe that uncertainty means abandonment. This account offers a different perspective. It reminds readers that limited vision does not mean God lacks purpose. Abraham never saw the entire picture. He only saw the next step. Yet step by step, he discovered that God was already present in the future he feared. There is another reason this narrative occupies such an important place in Scripture. It establishes a pattern that echoes throughout the Bible. Again and again, God reveals himself as the one who provides what people cannot provide for themselves. Again and again, human weakness becomes the setting for divine faithfulness. Again and again, moments that appear hopeless become opportunities for greater understanding. The mountain where Abraham's journey reached its climax became a lasting reminder of that reality. It stood as a testimony that faith is not the absence of questions. Faith is choosing trust when every answer has not yet arrived. It is believing that God's character remains constant even when circumstances change. It is recognizing that promises are anchored in the faithfulness of the one who made them. Looking back, the story was never primarily about loss. It was about trust. It was never primarily about fear. It was about faithfulness. It was never primarily about uncertainty. It was about discovering that God was already working beyond what human eyes could see. Abraham arrived at the mountain carrying questions. He left carrying deeper confidence in God's character. That transformation is the true heart of the account. The greatest revelation was not found in the challenge itself, but in what the challenge revealed. God had been faithful in the past. God was faithful in the present. And God would remain faithful in the future. That is why this ancient story continues to speak to readers today. Beneath every detail lies a timeless message. When the path ahead seems unclear, trust is not built on seeing the entire road. Trust is built on knowing the one who leads it.